There is an investigation by our good friend Sara Carter, and we've linked it to Hannity.com. She has our website, SaraACarter.com, but revealing that the documents and information, remember this issue we brought up last week about Adam Levenger, and it's a guy that, he lost his security clearance after Stefan Halper complained about him. Anyway, so long story short, there are new documents and information that Levenger had stumbled upon, and other documents that she has been able to obtain, raising really troubling questions about Stefan Halper, who was believed to have worked with the CIA and part of the matrix of players in the Bureau's Crossfire Hurricane investigation into the Trump campaign. And Halper, who assisted the FBI in the Russia investigation, appears to have significant ties, we're finding, to the Russian government, as well as a source connected directly to Vladimir Putin. Now, when Mr. Levenger raised concerns about the DOD's misuse of Stefan Halper in 2016, he did so without any political designs whatsoever or any knowledge of Mr. Halper's spying activities. And Sean Bigley is a partner specializing in federal security clearance defense, representing Adam Levenger. In this article that Sara has now just released, Mr. Levenger simply did what all Americans should expect of our civil servants. He reported violations of the law and a gross waste of public funds to his superiors. And yet we were puzzled to, find the ferocity of efforts to discredit Mr. Levenger, who's just trying to be a whistleblower and tell the truth. And then on top of it, there were leaks from the DOD of false and defamatory information to the press. And anyway, so Sean Bigley assumed that the other contractor about who Levenger explicitly raised questions, a close confidant of Hillary Clinton, was the reason for the sustained assault on Mr. Levenger, and that certainly may have played a role. But it was more than the Clinton-connected contacts, suspected Bigley, who added, Mr. Levenger unwittingly shined a spotlight on the deep state secret weapon, which was Stefan Halper, who threatened to expose the truth about Trump-Russia collusion narrative, then being plotted that it was all a setup. All right, joining us now with more. We're going to fill in the blanks and the details to all of this. Sara Carter, investigative reporter and Fox News contributor. Sean Bigley is with us, and he specializes in federal security clearance defense, representing Adam Levenger. Thank you both for being with us. Look, it gets a little more complicated. I'm just giving some of the highlights. Sara, why don't you really break this down, but very slowly, because it gets a little complicated.
So this is how this plays out, and I'm sure Sean Bigley will be able to explain a lot of his client, the circumstances that surrounded his client, Adam Levenger, who is a former Defense Department analyst. He became a whistleblower. He basically internally complained about some contracts that he stumbled on, and at the time, he had no idea who Stefan Halper was. He just knew that it was this professor, this Cambridge guy, who was getting this exorbitant amount of money for basically writing some analysis for the Defense Department on foreign policy issues. So he complains about that. He complains about another contract that was connected to a person that was very close to Chelsea Clinton.
By the way, we should say it was roughly $1 million in taxpayer-funded money.
Absolutely, Sean. So this is over $1 million in taxpayer-funded financing for some reports basically that he himself did not fully write. He contracted out foreign officials and others. Let's go back to George Papadopoulos. He got wrapped up in Stefan Halper's mess when Stefan Halper actually reached out to him and asked him to help write some foreign policy reports that he was basically compiling together and then turning in as his own. So over $1 million received for this. This is very concerning because it doesn't match other contracts. People do not get paid this much money. And when you look at this as a whole, when you look at the amount of writing that he actually did himself, it would be like getting paid $2,000 a page. $2,000 a page for writing, some of which he didn't even do himself.
But we also know that Halper assisted the FBI in the Russia investigation, and he has ties to the Russian government, and you believe Vladimir Putin himself?
Yes, absolutely, to people directly connected with Vladimir Putin. We know this only because we've been able to obtain, and this is, through various documentation, his course syllabi for the Cambridge intelligence seminar that he was holding. And he held those seminars from 2012 up until 2016. And one of the 2012 seminar course syllabi that we have shows that he brought to teach alongside him the former head of Russian intelligence. I mean, this is Trubnikov. Trubnikov was the top of the Russia's intelligence service from 1996 through 2000. He was appointed first deputy foreign minister from 2000 to 2004. And in 2004, he was appointed by President Putin to the ambassador of Russia. But let's just go back one step before we go any further. At the point in time when Adam Levenger was discovering these contracts, he had no clue as to who Stefan Halper was. He had no idea really up until recently, and you can talk to Sean Bigley about this, that Stefan Halper was even involved in this Russia collusion until it came out into the news. They had no idea that he was being utilized by the FBI to basically gather information on Carter Page and George Papadopoulos. And ironically, here's Stefan Halper trying to accuse Carter Page or trying to accuse George Papadopoulos of having these connections with Russia when it's Stefan Halper himself who has the most connection with Russia.
All right, let me bring in Levenger's attorney, Sean Bigley, who's with us. And why don't I let you just fill in some of the gaps here? So he just happened upon this information as it relates to Halper, and then he's a whistleblower. He's trying to explain why is this guy getting $2,000 a page and up to $1 million in payments, and where are these connections to Russia? How do you tie this all together?
Sure. So it's a really fascinating story, and I think, what Sara emphasized as far as the timeliness and the timeline of this with Mr. Levenger and his whistleblower disclosures is really, really important, because I think a lot of people at the left are going to look at this and say, oh, this is, a political story. It's not. This was a guy who was completely an apolitical actor, Mr. Levenger. He was a civil servant. He was doing his job, and he uncovered this stuff. And so for a very long time, for about a year when we were fighting this case, up until the news broke about Mr. Halper earlier this summer, we were really struggling to figure out why the Defense Department was going after him with such a vengeance. And all we could assume, as Sara referenced, was the fact that this other contractor that he had raised questions about has very close ties to the Clinton family. As we know from emails uncovered through Judicial Watch, this woman is actually a very close confidant of Hillary Clinton, and so we assumed that that was the reason for the animosity. Well, we now know that there's a lot more to the story, and the pieces of the puzzle are starting to sort of come together. But,
well, tie them together to us. What do you think it is that happened?
So what we think happened in hindsight is Mr. Halper was essentially being used by the Department of Defense or by the government, by the FBI, as sort of an off-the-books manager of aspiring, if you will. In essence, he was being paid these extraordinary sums of money to put together what Mr. Levenger and others have termed college-level research projects, many of which were farmed out to other academics to prepare. And turning these things in for, major paydays, $500,000, $400,000, things like that. And so when you look at, what he was actually doing versus what he was being paid for on paper, there is a tremendous disconnect. And simultaneously, he was being sent out to engage with foreign government officials to conduct what Mr. Levenger felt was foreign relations, which is something he specifically complained about. That is not a task that is legally assignable to contractors. And so we believe that Mr. Halper was using these funds that he was given, taxpayer funds by the Department of Defense, to essentially globetrot and develop contacts that he could then pump for information or use as far as influence peddling campaigns, and that was the true purpose of the expenditures.
Sara,
incredible. It's incredible, Sean, because it's illegal to do that, by the way, to use those type of contractors for foreign now, whether or not the government had a black ops type of situation with Halper is a whole other story, and that would raise questions as to what was really going on here. And I think only Congress can, through a hearing, can find out the truth. but it's quite stunning because, ironically, Halper himself, according to a number of reports, now remember, I have not been able to speak to Halper yet. He hasn't returned my phone calls or my emails, but his seminar was actually also being funded by Russians connected, oligarchs connected directly to Putin. I mean, some of that, it wasn't all of the funding, but a good sum of money was coming from Russia to help fund these seminars. And remember, in 2016, Halper basically said, yeah, well, I decided to shut down the seminar because I think the Russians are getting too close. Well, the Russians were getting close because apparently Halper himself was inviting them.
Well, explain that. He was basic
intelligence and was being paid.
How was he bringing them in and trying to get them close to the Trump campaign at the time?
Well, I think for Halper, he was being utilized, right? So he was actually being utilized by the FBI then to connect with both Carter Page, and he met Carter Page after Carter Page came back from Moscow. Carter Page attended one of his seminars, and just so happens that Halper becomes very friendly with Carter Page, starts reaching out to Carter Page, talks to him about, the similar issues about Russia, about intelligence, and Carter Page didn't speak at that seminar. He was just invited as a part of the seminar, but became very close with Halper. And at that time, it was when Halper began asking him a lot of questions, asking him about his relationship with the Russians, trying to gather information on him. It was the same thing that Halper did to George Papadopoulos, when Papadopoulos actually became suspicious of Halper and how intense he was when he started asking him questions. So what do you have to do with the Russians? What are you getting from them? And Papadopoulos is basically, I was told by his wife Simona, no, I have nothing to do with them. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. And that's when, I think at that point, when Papadopoulos started to become concerned about Halper.
Is there any, Sean Bigley, evidence to back up and corroborate unsavory contacts, connections, and this nefarious nexus you're describing?
Here's what we have, Sean, and I think when you look at the totality of the picture, it is truly stunning. We have evidence that, and just to back up for a second, obviously we have the Trump-Russia collusion, quote-unquote, narrative that has been put out there for now well over a year. And the entire genesis of that essentially was Mr. Halper going to the FBI, apparently, and saying, I've witnessed all these concerning interactions between Trump people and Russians. There's something afoot. And then the FBI gets involved. Well, what we now know is it was a setup. Essentially, Mr. Halper, who was organizing these seminars, invited the Trump people into the lion's den. He invited them in, knowing that his co-convener of these seminars is a noted Putin apologist who spent a decade in the State Academy in Moscow. His co-teacher or co-lead of this seminar was the former head of Russian intelligence. And according to the British press, a good chunk of his seminars were funded by a company that apparently British intelligence has identified.
I got to go to a break, but you have a paper trail that confirms all of this?
Yes.
All of it? Wow.
All of it.
All right, stay right there. We'll come back and ask about that when we get back. All right, final moments as we continue with Sarah Carter and Sean Bigley, who is representing Adam Levenger. All right, we were talking about the paper trail specifically, and I know, Sarah, you have seen a lot of the documents, and I know, Sean, you have a lot of the documents. What will it show, and where will this end?
So ultimately, Sean, we believe that this is the complete and utter undermining of this whole Russian-Trump collusion narrative, because it completely falls apart. Essentially, as I was saying earlier, we have documentary evidence that Mr. Halper invited the Trump officials into his seminars knowing full well that the Russians were present, the Russians were involved, and then later claimed that he was shutting down the seminars because the Russians were infiltrating them. It doesn't add up. And when you look at the context and the totality of the documentation, it becomes very, very clear what happened as far as...
So he set it up and then acted all surprised when it started to get exposed.
Exactly.
Sarah, last word.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. You can't act like the Russians were infiltrating your seminar when you sent them out invitations. And another thing that we don't want to forget about Halper was Halper was also the one that reported to the FBI that Lieutenant General Michael Flynn may have had indiscreet contact or strange contacts with the Russian woman, who, by the way, was at his seminar at a dinner hosted by Halper and Sir Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6, the former head of MI6 at the time, and all of a sudden these rumors spill out all across the disinformation campaign across the media against General Michael Flynn.
All right, thank you both for being with us. We appreciate it.